The winter sun peeked through the blinds of a modest two-story home in East Detroit, where a young boy sat cross-legged on his bedroom floor, carefully arranging newspaper clippings about FBI investigations. This wasn't just any child's game, it was the beginning of a dream that would shape his entire life. Special Agent Richardson hadn't always known he'd make it to the FBI, but he knew from an early age that he wanted to make a difference. Growing up in a tight-knit community where everyone looked out for each other, Richardson learned the value of protection and service from his father, a city bus driver who knew every passenger by name, and his mother, a dedicated elementary school teacher who spent extra hours helping struggling students. Their small home was filled with books about law enforcement, justice, and American history, not because they could afford a huge library, but because they visited the public library every Saturday without fail. In high school, Richardson wasn't just another face in the crowd. He was the kid who organized neighborhood watch programs when there was a spike in local break-ins. He was the student who started a peer mentoring program for middle schoolers struggling with bullying. His teachers noticed how he could diffuse tense situations with a calm voice and logical thinking, skills that would later prove invaluable in his career. "You've got something special," his high school counselor told him one day, sliding a brochure across her desk. "The FBI is looking for people exactly like you. People who understand their communities, who can think on their feet, who want to protect others." That conversation planted a seed that would grow into an unstoppable force. College wasn't easy for Richardson's family to afford, but through a combination of academic scholarships, part-time jobs, and sheer determination, he made it work. He studied criminal justice at Michigan State University, where he quickly stood out for his unique approach to problem-solving. While other students focused solely on textbook answers, Richardson always considered the human element in every case study. His college years weren't just about hitting the books. He joined the campus security committee, where he implemented new safety measures that are still in use today. He spent summers interning at local law enforcement agencies, learning the ropes from the ground up. Every experience, every challenge, was a stepping stone toward his ultimate goal. The day his FBI Academy acceptance letter arrived, Richardson's entire neighborhood celebrated. They had watched him grow from that curious kid with newspaper clippings to a determined young man ready to serve his country. The community pulled together to help with his moving expenses to Quantico, showing the same support they'd given him throughout his journey. At the academy, Richardson faced challenges that would have broken many others. Being one of the few black trainees in his class meant dealing with subtle glances and unspoken doubts. But instead of letting it discourage him, he used it as fuel to push harder. He stayed up later, trained longer, and studied deeper than anyone else. His instructors noticed not just his physical capabilities, but his exceptional ability to read people and situations. During tactical training, Richardson's unique background proved invaluable. While others relied purely on protocol, he brought in real-world understanding from his community experiences. He could anticipate how different people might react in various situations, making his approach to scenarios more effective and human-centered. His defining moment at the academy came during a complex hostage negotiation simulation. While other trainees approached it by the book, Richardson drew from his experience mediating neighborhood disputes back home. He managed to peacefully resolve the situation in record time, earning praise from even the toughest instructors. Graduation day at Quantico was more than just a ceremony, it was a testament to perseverance. Richardson's family sat in the audience, tears of pride streaming down their faces as he received his badge and credentials. His mother clutched a worn photo of that little boy with his FBI newspaper clippings, amazed at how far her son had come. As he began his work in the Atlanta field office, Richardson quickly proved himself as more than just another agent. He brought a fresh perspective to investigations, often finding connections that others missed. His ability to build trust with witnesses and informants became legendary in the office. People opened up to him because they could sense his genuine desire to help, not just close cases. By 2018, Richardson had worked his way up to leading high-profile investigations. His office wall held numerous commendations, but he wasn't interested in the accolades. What mattered to him was making a real difference in people's lives. He never forgot his roots or the community that helped shape him into the agent he had become. Every few months, Richardson would return to his old Detroit neighborhood to speak at schools and community centers. He wanted young people to see that their dreams, no matter how big, were achievable. Success isn't about where you start, he would tell them, it's about how determined you are to reach your destination. Little did Richardson know that his biggest test wasn't going to be in a high-stakes FBI operation, but rather on a quiet suburban street, where his badge and accomplishments would be challenged in ways he never imagined. His journey from that Detroit bedroom to the FBI had prepared him for many things, but what was coming next would test every ounce of his training, character, and resolve. The autumn evening had started like any other. Special Agent Richardson was driving home after wrapping up a successful operation that had taken months to complete. His team had just brought down a major drug trafficking ring, and the satisfaction of a job well done filled his thoughts. The streets of suburban Atlanta were quiet, street lamps casting long shadows across the well-maintained lawns of residential neighborhoods. He had just called his mother, as he always did after completing a major case. "Stay safe," she had said, like she always did. Those words echoed in his mind as he noticed the police cruiser pulling out behind his government-issued black sedan. At first, he didn't think much of it. He was doing everything by the book, driving 5 miles under the speed limit, all his lights working perfectly. The blue and red lights suddenly illuminated his rearview mirror. Richardson checked his speedometer again, then glanced at his watch, 9:45 p.m. He knew the drill, had even taught sessions about proper conduct during traffic stops at the bureau. With practiced calm, he turned on his interior lights, kept his hands visible on the steering wheel, and pulled over smoothly onto a well-lit stretch of road. Through his side mirror, Richardson observed the approaching officer. Something felt off about the way the officer moved, too tense, too aggressive for a routine stop. Officer Wilson's hand was already resting on his weapon, his flashlight beam dancing erratically across Richardson's car. Despite his decade of FBI experience, Richardson felt his heart rate quicken. He'd been here before, not as an FBI agent, but as a young black man growing up in Detroit. "License and registration," Wilson barked, his flashlight beam deliberately aimed to blind Richardson. The FBI agent spoke clearly and calmly. "Good evening, officer. I'm Special Agent Richardson with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I'm reaching for my credentials now." He moved his hand slowly toward his jacket pocket, where his badge and ID were stored. "I said license and registration." Wilson's voice grew harder, his hand tightening on his weapon. Richardson could feel sweat forming on his forehead despite the cool evening air. He kept his voice steady. "Sir, I understand your caution, but I am a federal agent. I'm going to slowly show you my FBI credentials." As Richardson carefully reached for his badge, Wilson stepped back, suddenly calling for backup. "Got a non-compliant subject, possibly armed." The words crackled over the radio, making Richardson's stomach sink. He knew those words could turn a simple stop into something much more dangerous. Within minutes, the quiet suburban street transformed into a scene of flashing lights and squealing tires as 3 more patrol cars arrived. Richardson remained perfectly still, his hands back on the steering wheel, his FBI credentials now lying untouched on the passenger seat. Years of training kicked in as he focused on keeping his breathing steady, knowing that remaining calm was his best defense. Through his mirrors, he could see the newly arrived officers taking positions around his vehicle, some with hands on their weapons. The situation was spiraling, but Richardson knew every move he made needed to be deliberate and non-threatening. He could hear Wilson briefing the other officers, painting a picture that didn't match reality. One young officer approached Wilson, speaking in hushed tones. Richardson could read the concern on the younger officer's face as he pointed at the government plates on Richardson's vehicle. But Wilson dismissed him with a sharp gesture, his body language growing more aggressive. Inside his car, Richardson weighed his options. He could call his supervisor. It was protocol in situations like this. But reaching for his phone now might escalate things further. He could step out of the car as ordered, but that would put him in an even more vulnerable position. Years of FBI training taught him to control situations, but right now, his best option was to stay still and let things unfold. The crisp autumn air carried fragments of conversation between the officers. Some seemed uncertain about Wilson's approach, especially after noticing the FBI parking permit clearly displayed on Richardson's windshield. But Wilson maintained control of the scene, his flashlight beam never wavering from Richardson's rearview mirror. Richardson thought about his mother's words again, stay safe. He thought about the young people he mentored, about the changes he wanted to make in law enforcement. Right now, he was living through exactly the kind of situation he worked to prevent. Every second felt like an hour as he sat there, his credentials within arm's reach, but might as well have been miles away. More cars were pulling up now, local residents, drawn by the commotion, slowing down to watch. Richardson could see them filming with their phones, their faces illuminated by their screens. In any other situation, he would have been the one taking charge, showing his badge, restoring order. Instead, he sat perfectly still, knowing that one wrong move could turn this situation tragic. The irony wasn't lost on him. Earlier that day, he had led a major federal operation, coordinating with multiple agencies to bring down criminals. Now, he sat helpless in his own vehicle, his authority and identity questioned despite clear evidence of who he was. The contrast was stark, a painful reminder of the challenges that persisted even at the highest levels of law enforcement. As the standoff continued, Richardson's training helped him notice details that might be important later: badge numbers, witness locations, the exact words being used. He was both participant and observer in a situation that was quickly becoming a textbook example of everything wrong with routine traffic stops. What should have been a 5-minute interaction was stretching into something much longer and more dangerous. The autumn night grew colder, but Richardson's focus never wavered. He knew that how he handled the next few moments could impact not just his own safety, but potentially influence how similar situations would be handled in the future. This routine traffic stop was about to become anything but routine. The red and blue lights continued to paint the suburban street in alternating colors as the situation grew more tense with each passing minute. Special Agent Richardson could feel the weight of his phone in his pocket. One call to his supervisor could change everything. But even that simple movement seemed dangerous now, with Officer Wilson's watchful eyes trained on his every breath. Exit the vehicle now. Wilson's command cut through the night air for the third time. Richardson's mind raced through his FBI training, weighing each possible response. He knew that stepping out of the car would make him more vulnerable, despite his rights as a federal agent. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had taught courses on de-escalation at Quantico, and now he was living through exactly the kind of situation he had warned others about. "Officer," Richardson projected his voice clearly but calmly, "I'm going to reach for my phone to contact my FBI supervisor. Everything I do will be slow and visible." He needed to document this, to have witnesses beyond the growing crowd of onlookers with their cell phones raised. "I said exit the vehicle." Wilson's voice cracked with anger. "Last warning." The officer's hand moved from his holster to his weapon, gripping it tightly. The other officers shifted uncomfortably, some exchanging worried glances. They could see the government plates, the FBI parking permit, the professional attire Richardson wore, all telling a different story than the one Wilson was pushing. One of the younger officers, fresh from the academy, stepped forward. "Sir, I can see his FBI credentials on the passenger seat," he said to Wilson, his voice carrying in the quiet night. But Wilson silenced him with a sharp gesture. "Back in position, rookie. This is my stop." Richardson's thoughts drifted to the training sessions he led just last month, teaching new agents about maintaining composure under pressure. Now those lessons were no longer theoretical. They were his lifeline. He kept his breathing steady, his movements minimal, his voice clear and professional despite the growing knot in his stomach. Through his mirrors, Richardson could see more patrol cars arriving, their lights adding to the chaos of the scene. The neighborhood had become an audience, with residents standing on their front lawns, some recording, others making phone calls. He recognized the looks on their faces. He'd seen them before at crime scenes, that mix of concern and curiosity. A small group of officers huddled near one of the patrol cars, clearly discussing the situation. Their body language told Richardson they were uncomfortable with how things were unfolding. One officer kept glancing at the FBI parking permit, then back at Wilson, clearly struggling with the disconnect between what they were seeing and how they were being ordered to respond. "I'm reaching for my phone now," Richardson announced clearly, making sure his voice carried to all the officers present. He needed witnesses to his compliance, to his professionalism. As his hand moved slowly toward his pocket, Wilson's reaction was immediate and explosive. "He's reaching. Hands where I can see them." Wilson's shout sent a jolt through the entire scene. Several officers raised their weapons instinctively, but quickly lowered them as they realized what was actually happening. The crowd of onlookers gasped collectively, their phones capturing every moment. Richardson froze, his hand halfway to his pocket. Years of experience told him this was a crucial moment. His next words needed to be perfect. "Officer Wilson," he said, using the name he'd glimpsed on the officer's badge. "I am Special Agent Richardson of the FBI. I am armed, as my position requires, but I am not reaching for my weapon. I am reaching for my phone to call my supervisor, as is protocol in this situation." The use of his name seemed to rattle Wilson momentarily. The other officers were watching now, not just the scene, but their fellow officers' behavior. The young officer who had spoken up earlier had his hand on his radio, clearly contemplating making a call of his own. In the distance, Richardson could hear more sirens approaching. He silently prayed they were bringing someone with enough authority to end the situation. The autumn wind carried whispers from the crowd, people sharing their own stories of similar encounters, their phones still recording every moment. Inside his car, Richardson maintained his composed exterior, but his mind was racing. He thought about his family, about the young people he mentored, about all the progress he'd helped make in law enforcement. Would it all be undone by one officer's prejudice? Would his story become another hashtag, another tragedy? Would his story become another hashtag, another tragedy? The escalating situation had transformed a quiet suburban street into what felt like a powder keg. More backup units were arriving, their lights creating a dizzying display that reflected off the windows of nearby homes. Some residents had moved closer, their faces showing a mix of concern and outrage as they witnessed the treatment of a federal agent. Through it all, Richardson kept his focus, knowing that his response to this situation could impact countless others who might face similar circumstances. He was no longer just an FBI agent trying to get home. He had become a living example of both the progress made and the long road still ahead in law enforcement relations. As the standoff continued, Richardson could see the growing uncertainty in the faces of the other officers. They were caught between their duty to support a fellow officer and their understanding that something was very wrong with this situation. The tension in the air was palpable, like a rubber band stretched to its breaking point. What had started as a routine traffic stop had become a stark illustration of the challenges that persisted in law enforcement, even for those who had reached the highest levels of federal service. As more minutes ticked by, Richardson knew that how this situation resolved would have ripple effects far beyond this suburban street in Atlanta. 45 minutes can feel like an eternity when you're sitting perfectly still, hands on the steering wheel, surrounded by flashing lights and drawn weapons. Special Agent Richardson's FBI training had prepared him for hostage situations, armed standoffs, and high-stakes negotiations. But nothing had quite prepared him for being treated like a suspect in his own vehicle, his badge and credentials lying ignored on the passenger seat. The night air had grown colder, and Richardson could see his breath forming small clouds inside the car. He'd kept the engine off out of caution. Any sudden movements or sounds could make things worse. Through his mirrors, he watched Officer Wilson pacing back and forth, occasionally barking orders into his radio. The other officers had formed a loose perimeter around the car, their stances revealing their growing unease with the situation. "I've got a dash cam recording everything," Richardson announced calmly, making sure his voice carried to all the officers present. He noticed several of them glancing at their body cameras, suddenly more aware that their actions were being documented. Wilson's response was immediate and telling. "Turn off that camera now," Wilson demanded, his voice carrying the edge of panic. Richardson kept his voice steady as he replied, "Officer, as a federal agent, I'm required to maintain recordings of all interactions during duty hours. This is for everyone's protection." The crowd of onlookers had grown, their phones capturing every moment of the standoff. Richardson could hear snippets of their conversations, some calling local news stations, others reaching out to community leaders. The young officer who had spoken up earlier was now on his radio, speaking in hushed but urgent tones, his discomfort with the situation clearly visible. Inside the car, Richardson's mind wandered to the training sessions he led at the FBI Academy. He had always emphasized the importance of staying calm under pressure, but now those words took on new meaning. His own heart was racing, but his exterior remained composed, knowing that his response to this situation could impact how similar incidents were handled in the future. Through the windshield, Richardson watched as two more police cruisers arrived, their lights adding to the surreal display. One of the new officers approached Wilson, speaking in low tones while gesturing toward Richardson's FBI credentials, still clearly visible on the passenger seat. Wilson's response was loud enough for everyone to hear. "I don't care if he claims he's the director of the FBI. He's going to follow my commands." The irony of the situation wasn't lost on Richardson. Earlier that day, he had led a multi-agency operation, coordinating with local law enforcement to bring down a major criminal enterprise. Now, he sat helpless in his car, his authority questioned, his identity disputed, all because one officer couldn't see past his own prejudices. Time seemed to move differently as the standoff continued. Richardson noticed small details, how some officers had positioned themselves to appear compliant with Wilson's orders while actually maintaining distance from the scene. He saw the growing number of community members gathering, their presence both a comfort and a concern. He knew their witness could help ensure his safety, but he worried about the situation escalating with so many civilians nearby. The dashcam continued recording, its small red light a steady reminder that everything was being documented. Richardson had activated it the moment he was pulled over, a habit born from years of experience and an understanding of the importance of accountability. Now it was capturing every word, every action, every moment of this increasingly tense situation. A light drizzle began to fall, creating halos around the police lights that still painted the scene in alternating red and blue. Richardson could hear Wilson making another call, his voice tight with frustration as he apparently received pushback from someone higher up in the chain of command. The other officers were becoming more visibly uncomfortable, some exchanging glances that spoke volumes about their assessment of the situation. Through it all, Richardson maintained his position, hands visible on the steering wheel, voice calm and professional whenever he spoke. He thought about his family, about the young people he mentored, about all the progress that had been made in law enforcement relations, and about how fragile that progress could be. The growing crowd of onlookers now included several people in pajamas and robes, drawn from their homes by the commotion. Richardson could hear them talking about social media, about live streams, about calling news stations. What had started as a simple traffic stop was becoming a very public display of the challenges that still existed in law enforcement. In the distance, Richardson heard another siren approaching. Something about its tone was different, not a regular patrol car. He silently hoped it was bringing someone with enough authority to end the situation. The young officer who had tried to intervene earlier perked up at the sound too, clearly hoping for the same thing. The dashcam's memory card was filling up with footage that Richardson knew would eventually become evidence, not just of this incident, but of the larger issues it represented. Every minute that passed was another minute of documentation, another minute of truth that couldn't be denied or explained away. As the new siren grew closer, Richardson remained focused on maintaining his composure. He had faced dangerous situations before, but this was different. This wasn't about physical danger as much as it was about standing firm in the face of injustice while maintaining his professionalism. His actions now could help determine how similar situations would be handled in the future. The standoff had transformed a quiet suburban street into a scene that would be talked about for years to come. But for Richardson, sitting perfectly still in his government-issued sedan, it was about more than just this moment. It was about proving that change was possible, even in the face of deeply rooted prejudices, and that professionalism and dignity could prevail even in the most challenging circumstances. The distinctive siren grew louder, cutting through the tension-filled air. Special Agent Richardson recognized the sound. It was an FBI vehicle. Through his rearview mirror, he could see Officer Wilson's posture stiffen as a black SUV with federal plates turned onto the street, its lights piercing the darkness. The SUV pulled up deliberately, parking at an angle that put it in clear view of both Richardson's dashboard camera and the officer's body cameras. The door opened and FBI Assistant Director Cooper stepped out, her presence immediately commanding attention. She was still wearing her formal attire from the day's operation briefing, her FBI windbreaker thrown hastily over her suit. "I need a status report now," Cooper's voice carried across the scene with authority. The growing crowd of onlookers fell silent, phones still recording as they witnessed this new development. Officer Wilson stepped forward, but before he could speak, the young officer who had tried to intervene earlier quickly approached Cooper. "Ma'am," the young officer spoke clearly. The driver identified himself as an FBI agent from the beginning. He has credentials visible on the passenger seat, and the vehicle has federal plates. He's been fully cooperative, but he glanced nervously at Wilson, then continued, but he wasn't allowed to reach for his phone to contact his supervisor. Cooper's expression remained professional, but her eyes narrowed as she surveyed the scene. Multiple patrol cars, weapons drawn, all focused on one of her top agents sitting calmly in his vehicle. She approached Richardson's car, her movements deliberate and visible to all officers present. "Agent Richardson," she called out, "are you all right?" Her voice carried a mix of concern and controlled anger. Richardson responded with the same professional calm he'd maintained throughout the ordeal. "Yes, Director. I'm unharmed. Everything has been recorded on my dash cam." Wilson stepped forward, his voice raised. He was non-compliant with. Cooper cut him off with a raised hand, her attention still focused on Richardson. "Agent, please slowly exit your vehicle and bring your credentials." The difference in how she gave the command was stark, respectful, professional, acknowledging Richardson's status and dignity. As Richardson carefully opened his door, the contrast between his composed demeanor and Wilson's agitation became impossible to ignore. The gathered crowd murmured as Richardson stepped out, his suit pristine despite the long ordeal, his movements measured and professional. He retrieved his credentials with deliberate slowness, ensuring every action was visible to all cameras present. Cooper examined Richardson's credentials briefly, a formality, as she had just seen him earlier that day leading a major operation. She then turned to address the assembled officers, her voice carrying the weight of federal authority. "This man is Special Agent Richardson, one of our most respected field agents. He just led a major multi-agency operation this morning that several of your colleagues participated in." The impact of her words was immediate. Several officers lowered their weapons, some looking genuinely embarrassed. The young officer who had tried to help earlier nodded slowly, as if having his suspicions confirmed. But Wilson remained defiant, his hand still resting on his weapon. He was driving suspiciously through. Wilson began, but Cooper interrupted again. "Officer Wilson, your body camera is recording, correct? So is Agent Richardson's dashcam, and approximately," she glanced at the crowd, 30 civilian phones. "Would you like to explain what looked suspicious about a federal agent driving a government vehicle home from work?" The silence that followed was deafening. Other officers began stepping back, physically distancing themselves from Wilson's position. The crowd continued recording, their phones capturing this moment of accountability. Some were nodding in approval, others wiping away tears of relief or anger. Richardson maintained his professional composure, but he could feel the weight of the moment. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about every person who had ever faced similar treatment, every officer who had stayed silent when they should have spoken up, every change that still needed to happen in law enforcement. Cooper turned to the other officers present. "I want statements from everyone here. Your body camera footage will be requested as evidence in a federal investigation." Her words sent a ripple through the group. Several officers immediately began checking their cameras, ensuring they were still recording. The young officer who had tried to intervene stepped forward again. "Ma'am, there's something else you should know." He glanced at Wilson, then continued, "This isn't the first time. There have been other incidents. Some of us have been concerned, but," his voice trailed off, but his meaning was clear. As if a dam had broken, other officers began nodding, some stepping forward to share their own observations. Wilson's face grew increasingly pale as his colleagues, one by one, began to distance themselves from his actions. The toxic culture of silence was cracking right there on that suburban street. Richardson watched the scene unfold, still maintaining his professional demeanor. He thought about all the times he trained young agents about maintaining composure under pressure, about being the change they wanted to see in law enforcement. Tonight, that training had possibly saved his life, and now it was helping to expose a bigger problem. The crowd of onlookers had grown even larger, their phones still recording every moment. Local news vans were beginning to arrive, drawn by the numerous calls from concerned citizens. What had started as one officer's prejudiced actions was about to become a catalyst for real change. Cooper turned back to Richardson, her voice softening slightly. "Agent, will need your dash cam footage and a full statement." Then, addressing the crowd, she spoke with clear authority. "The FBI takes civil rights violations extremely seriously. What happened here tonight will be thoroughly investigated." As the tension began to dissipate, Richardson could see the impact of this moment rippling through everyone present. The other officers were talking quietly among themselves, some already writing down their observations. The young officer who had spoken up was being approached by his colleagues, receiving quiet words of support for his courage. This night would change things, not just for one officer or one department, but for how law enforcement handled similar situations in the future. The truth, captured on multiple cameras and witnessed by dozens, would be impossible to ignore or explain away. Change was coming, one brave stand at a time. The morning after the incident, Special Agent Richardson sat in his office at the FBI field headquarters, reviewing the dash cam footage. The video was crystal clear, every word, every action, every moment of those tense 45 minutes captured in high definition. His hand trembled slightly as he pressed pause, the events of the previous night still fresh in his mind. 3 cups of coffee sat cold on his desk, untouched. His phone hadn't stopped buzzing since dawn, calls from family, fellow agents, and news outlets all wanting to hear his story. The video had already gone viral, shared thousands of times across social media platforms. His mother had called 5 times, her voice mixing worry with pride when he finally answered. "You have a choice to make," Assistant Director Cooper said, standing in his office doorway. She wasn't just his superior, she had witnessed firsthand the previous night's events. "You can keep quiet, file the standard reports, let the system handle it internally." She paused, knowing that wasn't really an option for him. "Or you can take a stand." Richardson looked up from his computer screen, his decision already made. "I became an FBI agent to protect people and uphold justice," he said, his voice firm. "If I stay quiet now, I'm part of the problem." Cooper nodded, having expected nothing less from one of her best agents. The next few weeks became a whirlwind of activity. Richardson worked with the FBI's Civil Rights Division, providing detailed statements and evidence. The dash cam footage was analyzed frame by frame. Body camera footage from every officer at the scene was collected and reviewed. Civilian videos from multiple angles helped create a complete picture of the incident. But Richardson didn't stop there. He made the brave decision to speak publicly about his experience. "If this can happen to an FBI agent in a government vehicle," he said during his first press conference, "imagine what happens to ordinary citizens who don't have badges and credentials to protect them." His words resonated across the country. Other law enforcement officers began coming forward with their own stories of witnessing prejudice within their departments. The young officer who had spoken up that night became an unexpected ally, providing crucial testimony about previous incidents involving Officer Wilson. The investigation revealed a pattern of similar stops in Wilson's record, traffic stops that lasted too long, escalated too quickly, and disproportionately targeted minority drivers. Data analysts at the FBI compiled statistics that showed a clear pattern of bias in his enforcement actions. Richardson spent his evenings reviewing police training procedures, identifying gaps that allowed such incidents to occur. He worked with legal experts to draft proposals for new protocols regarding interagency interactions. His experience as both an FBI agent and a victim of profiling gave him a unique perspective that couldn't be ignored. The police department's Internal Affairs Division, under intense public scrutiny, conducted their own investigation. The evidence was overwhelming, not just from that night, but from years of documented incidents that had gone unaddressed. Other officers, emboldened by Richardson's stand, began sharing their own observations of Wilson's behavior. Community meetings were held, with Richardson often present, listening to similar stories from local residents. He sat quietly as people shared their experiences, each story reinforcing the importance of what he was doing. These weren't just statistics or reports. These were real people who had faced similar treatment without the protection of a badge. The media attention grew, but Richardson remained focused on creating real change. He worked with police academy instructors to develop new training modules about bias recognition and prevention. His own dash cam footage became a teaching tool used to show future officers how quickly prejudice can escalate a routine situation. 1 month after the incident, Richardson sat in a federal courtroom, preparing to testify. The evidence had been compiled: videos from multiple angles, witness statements, statistical analysis of Wilson's traffic stops, and testimony from fellow officers. The young officer who had tried to help that night sat in the witness box, describing years of similar incidents that had gone unreported. The courthouse was surrounded by supporters and media, but inside, Richardson remained calm and professional. As he took the stand, he remembered that night, sitting in his car, hands on the steering wheel, choosing to remain composed despite the injustice he faced. Now that composure would help him tell his story clearly and effectively. His testimony lasted for hours, detailed and precise. He described not just the events of that night, but the larger issues it represented. He spoke about the importance of accountability in law enforcement, about the need for officers to speak up when they witness wrongdoing, about the courage it takes to stand against systemic problems. The investigation expanded beyond just one officer. Department policies were scrutinized, training procedures were questioned, and supervision protocols were examined. What had started as one incident was becoming a catalyst for departmental reform. Throughout it all, Richardson maintained his professionalism. He continued his FBI duties, leading investigations and mentoring young agents. But now he had an additional mission, using his experience to create positive change in law enforcement. Support came from unexpected places. Other federal agencies began reviewing their own protocols for interagency interactions. Police departments across the country requested copies of the new training materials being developed. The incident was becoming a case study in how to address and prevent similar situations. As weeks turned into months, Richardson's stand for justice began showing real results. Policy changes were implemented, training programs were updated, and most importantly, other officers felt empowered to speak up when they witnessed misconduct. What had started as a frightening encounter on a suburban street was transforming into a movement for positive change in law enforcement. 1 year after that fateful traffic stop, Special Agent Richardson stood at the podium in the Police Academy auditorium. The room was packed with new recruits, seasoned officers, and federal agents, all there to learn from his experience. The dashcam footage played on the screen behind him, but this time it wasn't evidence in a case. It was a teaching tool, a way to show future officers how to recognize and prevent similar situations. That night changed more than just my life, Richardson began, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. It changed how we think about accountability in law enforcement. The young officer who had spoken up that night, now promoted to sergeant, sat in the front row, nodding in agreement. The changes that had rippled through law enforcement over the past year were remarkable. Officer Wilson's dismissal from the force was just the beginning. The investigation had led to a complete overhaul of traffic stop procedures in departments across the country. Body cameras were no longer just recording devices, they had become tools of accountability and protection for both officers and citizens. Richardson's inbox was filled with messages from other law enforcement officers sharing their own stories of standing up against prejudice within their departments. The blue wall of silence was starting to crack, replaced by a new understanding that true loyalty meant speaking up when something was wrong. The FBI had created a new training program, with Richardson as its lead instructor. Breaking barriers became mandatory for all federal agents and was being adopted by police departments nationwide. The program didn't just focus on what went wrong that night, it taught officers how to recognize their own biases and support colleagues who spoke up against misconduct. In community meetings, Richardson shared the podium with local residents, listening to their experiences and working together to build trust. He made sure every training session included voices from the community, believing that understanding had to flow both ways. "We can't fix what we don't acknowledge," became his motto, repeated in police academies across the nation. The young people Richardson mentored now included both aspiring law enforcement officers and community activists. He helped them understand that real change happened when people from different perspectives worked together. His office walls were covered with letters from grateful citizens and fellow officers who had found the courage to speak up because of his example. The dashcam footage from that night had been viewed millions of times, but now it was accompanied by discussions about positive changes in police departments. Social media that had once spread anger now shared stories of officers intervening to prevent bias, of departments implementing new training programs, of communities and police working together. Richardson's mother still called him every night after his shift, but now her voice carried pride without worry. She had watched her son turn a traumatic experience into a force for positive change. "You didn't just stand up for yourself that night," she told him. "You stood up for everyone who ever faced that kind of treatment." The police department where the incident occurred had transformed. Under new leadership, they implemented some of the strictest accountability measures in the country. The young sergeant who had spoken up that night helped create a peer support program for officers who witnessed misconduct, ensuring they had the backing they needed to come forward. During a national law enforcement conference, Richardson shared the stage with other agents and officers who had helped expose and address bias in their departments. Together, they represented a new generation of law enforcement, one that understood that true strength came from accountability and justice, not silence and protection of wrongdoing. Richardson's FBI office became a model for community engagement. Local residents knew they could come there with concerns and be heard. Other field offices across the country began adopting similar approaches, breaking down barriers between federal agents and the communities they served. The training materials developed from his experience reached beyond law enforcement. Companies, schools, and organizations requested presentations about standing up against bias and the importance of speaking up. Richardson's story became a case study in professional schools, teaching future leaders about moral courage and institutional change. One evening, driving home from work, Richardson noticed a police car behind him. This time, when the officer approached his window, there was professional courtesy, respect, and an understanding that they were both part of the same mission, serving and protecting all citizens equally.